You secretly agreed that you would support an invasion of Iraq. Is that true?
It is complete rubbish.
Here's a fella who's willing to stand for what he believes. In the face of criticisms or political consequence, he was willing to say, this is what I believe, and I'm going to stand strong. And I admire those kind of characteristics in people.
In April 1999, he outlined what became known as the Blair Doctrine.
We have learnt twice before in this century that appeasement does not work. If we let an evil dictator range unchallenged, we will have to spill infinitely more blood and more treasure to stop him later.
My view, as outlined in that Chicago speech, was that we should regard ourselves in political terms living in an international community, that if there was a problem in one part of the world, it would affect the other part, and that we should regard ourselves as under an obligation to intervene and to help. To me, this is an aspect of the modern world in exactly the same way that it matters to us economically, so it should matter to us politically what happens in different parts of the world.
And who just believes in some basic fundamentals. And we didn't have long religious discussions. I mean, you know, what do you think of certain passages in the Bible? But I think it's more of kind of a psychology and a mood. It's just a general trust. I don't know if Tony Blair would ever say George Bush is my great personal friend. You know, he may. But I can tell you that my relationship was one that was comfortable. We laughed a lot. He kindly laughed at my corny jokes, and I laughed at his not corny jokes. I view our relationship as a relationship forged in battle, a relationship that was writing the first chapter of this ideological struggle against cold-blooded murderers who kill the innocent to achieve political objectives.
Is that how you see it too?
Yes, I do see it like that. I mean, I think this is partly about the modern world and Islam's place in it, but it's also partly about whether people are able to create, disputes in which people end up hating each other rather than reconciling. And it is a struggle for a generation. I don't have any doubt about that at all.
So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. Soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
The focus in the war on terror somehow shifts to Iraq. Why did that happen?
Basically, I took the view after September the 11th that we had to alter completely our view about nuclear, chemical, biological weapons proliferation. That if we ever ended up in a situation where terrorists were able to gain access to these weapons, then they would use them. Because to me, the most important aspect of September the 11th, apart from the obvious human tragedy, was the fact that they killed 3,000 people, but if they'd been able to kill 30,000, that would have been better for them.
There were 3 key meetings between Bush and Blair on the road to war in Iraq. The first occurred at the president's ranch a year before the invasion.
I'm going to put to you that at or around the time you went to visit President Bush at the Crawford Ranch in Texas, you secretly agreed that you would support an invasion of Iraq. Is that true?
It is complete rubbish that when I went to see President Bush at the ranch in Crawford in April 2002, that I said, right, okay, I'm up for it. What's more, he was not of that view at that time.
So what was discussed and decided at Crawford?
Only that the issue had to be confronted one way or another. But obviously if it could be confronted differently and peacefully, that would be better. My view was always that if you built a strong enough international coalition, then it was possible to avoid military action. It was even possible, actually, to either to get rid of the regime or change it, its nature fundamentally, if the international community stayed together.
It was clear the Middle East peace process was not a priority for the Bush administration. For Blair, it now became vital to succeed in the second part of the two-pronged strategy he'd developed to bind the international community together. He had to persuade Bush to take the Iraq issue to the UN. In July, he dispatched his senior foreign policy advisor to Washington. But by now, all the talk in the media was of war. In August 2002, Bush and Blair spoke on the phone.
I remember a conversation when I was on holiday in France and spoke to him, and there was sort of fever pitch in the American media and indeed parts of the British media about imminent military action, and him actually saying to me, you know, they're all going to calm down. I mean, you know, we haven't figured this thing out yet.
It was time they did figure it out. A couple of weeks later, in early September, the two men met at Camp David for the second of their key meetings on the road to war.
The point about the September 2002 meeting was that it was really about the United Nations. Did we go down that route or not? And in the end, there was quite a discussion about it. And I mean, I certainly felt that it was resolved that we would go back to the UN.
But the president had also reached a vital understanding with Blair.
I think he was a little concerned as to whether or not I recognized how important it was to utilize the United Nations as a way to rally support, and I assured him that I wasn't, but I also assured him that sometimes you can get stuck in the United Nations to no end, and that at some point in time, if we get stuck, he and I, along with others, may have to say, well, enough's enough. Something has to happen. And he confirmed that he understood that was the case, and that gave me great, that helped me realize I wasn't going to the UN alone, for example, and wouldn't be the only guy saying, wait a minute, enough is enough. Thank you all.
Bush was in no doubt about the significance of the commitment he'd obtained from Blair. It was now explicitly understood, if the UN route failed, Britain would stand by America, even if it meant war. Some of Blair's closest foreign policy advisors felt he had given away Britain's best bargaining chip too cheap, too early.
David. Colin Powell said, in the end, Blair would never lie down on the railroad tracks. Jack Straw and I would get him all pumped up about an issue, and he'd be ready to say, look here, George. But as soon as he saw the president, he would lose all steam.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a view, which is that, I didn't really believe in this action, and therefore, at some point, I should have been prepared to say, look, I'm not going to do this unless you do X, Y, and Z. I mean, it wasn't a bargaining chip for me. It was what I believed, and I still do believe it. You see, the trouble is maybe, and I can't answer this, maybe some others didn't believe in it. I believed in it. I wasn't in a position where I was negotiating with him in order to get him to do something different. In my view, if it wasn't clear that the whole nature of the way Saddam was dealing with this issue had changed, I was in favor of military action. I was going to be arguing for military action. I'm afraid it's in one sense, is kind of worse than people think, as far as my position is concerned. I believed in it. I believed in it then, I believe in it now.
We will work with the UN Security Council for the necessary resolutions. But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted. The Security Council resolutions will be enforced.
A skeptical public at home. His case for war was based on Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction. In September, he presented an intelligence dossier to Parliament.
His weapons of mass destruction program is active, detailed, and growing.
The weapons of mass destruction program is not shut down, it is up and running now. Were you lying?
No, look, the intelligence of every sort of country in the world was more or less the same, which was that Saddam had an active program. The fact is that Saddam had used chemical weapons against his own people. The inspectors, when they'd left those years back, had said that there was this massive amount unaccounted for. At no point were people saying, from any of the intelligence services, including our own, well, actually, you're barking up the wrong tree, it doesn't exist.
I think what's being said is that you expressed a certainty about the intelligence which actually you weren't quite entitled to.
Yes, but I think that is why it is actually important that people go and read the reports. Because it's true that there were debates in those reports about the extent of it. You can't be sure about how far it's growing and so on. Is it growing fast? Is it growing at a slower pace and so on? But I mean, as I say, I just simply defy people to go back and read them and say, well, actually, you conclude from that he didn't have such a program. Or it was an issue whether he had such a program. It's just published the JIC reports. I mean, if we'd done that, we would have had no controversy at all, because those are the reports that I was receiving. And what I always say to people when they write to me or talk to me about this is say, well, look, they're on the website now, go and read them, and then tell me that you would have concluded from that there wasn't a problem.
In meetings with the British, Chirac made little attempt to hide his disdain for the American president.
I can't remember President Chirac's exact words, but the sense of them was that he had contempt, really, for George W. Bush, and therefore didn't buy into any part of George W. Bush's agenda. He felt that George W. Bush was somebody who had kind of come from nowhere, knew very little about the world, had very little experience, very little wisdom, and therefore was reaching pretty radical conclusions about the state of the world on very little knowledge.
By the new year, a Franco-Russian-German bloc, firmly opposed to the war in Iraq, was starting to solidify.
We didn't believe the reasons are sound to wage war. You will go into a fight with a revolutionary nationalism, which will, maybe you bring together nationalism and the new religious-driven political Islam, Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism.